just want to say three things up front. First of all, you're one of the first people I started following on the TikTok platform.
No kidding. What?
And yeah, and because we were all kind of thrown into the turmoil of COVID, it was almost like, it was always nice to hear your point of view, your perspective, because you were always in the center of it and in the front lines of the horror. And, there was so much hysteria in the beginning that you didn't know who to listen to. So that was like I think you played an important role, not only to me, but to a lot of people, clearly.
Thank you. No, I feel like it was almost exactly a year ago, right? Where everything started to get real.
Yeah.
Like where everything, like the, WHO declared a global whatever. And then, basically, I feel like it was almost a year ago that things got serious. But before that, I think for a lot of us, it was like, okay, we heard about this virus in China and you heard about like, oh, there was a case in Seattle, but it still felt so far away and it didn't feel real. And I actually had a trip planned to London with one of my girlfriends in like May or April or something. And we were like, oh, do you think we can go? I was like, we were like, yeah, we totally can go. Like, this is going to be blown over. But like, we had no clue, right? So we'd be like, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't be able to go in April or May? And then like, once things started to like shut down and there were like, state of emergencies and stuff, I was like, this shit is real. Like something is not. And then here in Boston and New York, like in parallel, we experienced like a huge surge early, like in, March, April, May. And it was awful. Like it was so bad. It was so scary. It was so bad. It was, we didn't know anything about COVID then. And it was around that time where I think a lot of fear and uncertainty came in because you just didn't know where you were safe or when it would end, and for me still having to go to work and just not knowing what I was bringing home.
Are you still working in the same place?
Yep. Yeah. I work at a hospital in Boston, a really big hospital, and everything changed there too, kind of, obviously visitors weren't allowed at that point. Masking wasn't, I think, a rule for like employees and visitors. I think we weren't all doing masking at the time, but it was just this period. I just recall this period of just like uncertainty and fear and just not feeling good about anything. Everything just was bad and scary and just had no idea where things were going to go. So looking back to a year ago, it's amazing how much we've learned. And then after we experienced all of that in New York, it really got me upset looking at the rest of the country then following suit. Like other parts of the country started having it really bad. And I'm like, why did they not learn lessons from New York and Boston? Like we suffered. So you guys shouldn't have to. But I don't know. It was, reflecting back on that, it was a really crazy time, really uncertain time. Well, still is a little, but it's not as bad.
I remember you just trying to like tell people what it has to, bottom line stuff, So yeah. You were learning on the job as things were happening, right? And
yeah.
So
I mean, all of us were just kind of, data was from a scientific standpoint, like it was actually very exciting because so much like research was going on. Like people with big brains were really trying to think about this virus and how to understand it and how it's transmitted and incubation periods and what the presentation's like clinically. And people were publishing things left and right because we needed data and information out there for us to understand what was happening. So in that sense, it was like super exciting because it was this period of like, of like rapid research and like a lot of data collection happening, which was good from a scientific perspective. But there, every week, I feel like we learn something new about the virus. Every week we learn more about like asymptomatic spread or, things like that.
Yeah. So was it part of your work, like you would have like a weekly like updates with like doctors or the CDC? I mean, how?
Yeah, like, so my hospital is huge, like a huge hospital. So I wasn't part of like any of those high level conversations, but yeah, the hospital would disseminate, weekly, if not twice a week, emails that would describe, how many patients were hospitalized with COVID, patients in the ICU, just give us overall sort of updates on things like new discoveries or new understandings of things or new policies in the hospital. So it felt good in the sense that we were constantly getting updates from hospital leadership about things that were going on, but there was still this overwhelming sense of uncertainty and like fear of not knowing where it was going.
I guess the biggest thing for me at that moment, like around a year ago today, is that when pretty much the whole country felt like mortality is in our reach. It's like we all could have died within, not knowing if you were touching a knob, going to, it was so weird.
Yep. Yep.
And
I totally agree. When you put yourself back in that position, we had no idea what the next week or the next month was going to look like. Like there really was a threat that grocery stores would, like the whole food supply chain would be disrupted. Like there was a threat that, toilet paper supply chain would be disrupted. Like we had no idea. So was it wrong to prepare in that way? I don't think it was wrong, but because for me, I have kids. I have two little kids, and I'm like, I cannot risk like my kids not having what they need.
Right.
So we stocked up on a lot of stuff and like water and bottled water and things like that. Because
how old are your kids?
They're 4 and 2. They're little, yeah, they're really little, and we took them out of daycare and everything, but it's just at the time with so much uncertainty and so much unknown. I think the level of kind of doomsday preparation that we were all doing, I don't think it was the wrong thing to do, because in hindsight, it's always 2020, right? In hindsight, we were like, oh, I didn't need that 50-pound bag of beans. So this pandemic has revealed so much. And I think one of the things that has really come to light and become very evident is sort of the disparities in our culture and our society with regard to socioeconomic disparities. It's clear that this pandemic has affected certain people much harder than others. I am grateful every day at the privilege that I have, that like we have our home still, we have our jobs still, my kids are safe. I have the option of getting a nanny instead of taking them to daycare. Like I recognize that not all families have that option. And a lot of people would say that in my videos in the comments, be like, all you care about is that you're not thinking about the economic impact and the mom and pop businesses. I mean, I do. Like, I do think about that. I think about that all the time. And I think about all the time how lucky I am and how awful it is for people who don't have the same privileges that I do. But this is a pandemic that we've never as a society had to deal with before.
Wait, people would actually try to make you feel guilty for not having.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. You don't care about small businesses. You just I'm like, come on, really? You can't do both? Like, come on, I can do both. I can care about the pandemic and want people to wear masks and isolate as much as they can or keep distance. I can also worry and care very much about people who've lost jobs and lost their businesses. Like, how can I not do both?
I mean, it was a catastrophe throughout the world. I definitely want to say that what's happening now, what your post yesterday was really hit me. And I am sure you must know, I'm very anti-white supremacy, you know what I mean? My family survived the Holocaust. I'm been a victim of anti-Semitism since I'm like a child. So I feel, and I was bused to an all-black high school, so within that environment, I was still like the other and, this minority. And I kind of feel like I just don't think what's happening now in America is sustainable. And I just want you to just talk about what you feel is happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly this year has not only brought the pandemic, but George Floyd and other incidents that really raised awareness in a much more kind of visible way about the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter didn't start this year, but it just became so much more visible this year. And I don't know if it's a coincidence that it's happening all at the same time as the pandemic, or if it's somehow related, with the pandemic, but there's no question that injustices have become very evident. And I think that people are less afraid to be more vocal about it, which is great. In my platform, I do talk pretty much all the time about COVID. So I haven't been personally, I feel very strongly about supporting Black Lives Matter. I feel very strongly that white supremacy is the root cause of so many things that we're dealing with in this country right now. And I think more recently, with the uptick in hate crimes against Asians and Asian Americans in this country, it's obviously hit much more closer to home for me being an Asian American, because it does feel like it's tied into the pandemic, because it does feel like it is based a lot in xenophobia. There's no question that the former president's rhetoric about the China virus, the Wuhan flu, Kung flu, all these sort of derogatory and inappropriate terms for the virus that he used, no question that that really fanned the flame of people who were already xenophobic or racist in some way. Now they have an excuse to kind of go after these people who to them represent the reason why life is so different now, and they have to wear masks and isolate and such. But yeah, it's hit really close to home, and it's hit me in a way that I didn't really expect it to. I think, Asian people in this country, Asian people in general, are often very silent. We're not, as a people, culturally particularly active with regard to activism. It's not historically kind of what Asian people tend to do. This is overgeneralization. So
Right.
it doesn't feel natural sometimes for me to be that outspoken. About it, but I just feel so compelled to say something about it now, because it is, I hate that it's gotten to this point, and that's what's forced me to get to this point of being vocal about it. But I feel very strongly that what's happening now is just not okay. Like, it's just so not okay. When I think back to when the murder of George Floyd happened and how enraged I was on behalf of the Black American community. And I really kind of struggled with how to express that on my platform, because I know how I felt, which was outrage that this is an injustice, that, I was as pissed off as anybody else. But I really struggled with how to express it, because I would come across a lot of posts from Black creators who would, on one hand, say, like, thank you to all of our allies, all the allies of Black Lives Matter who are not of the Black community. Thank you for being there with us and supporting us. And then the next thing I'd scroll to would be a Black creator saying, basically it's performative. It's people who
Right.
just want to do this for clout, or it's a trend to say you're a Black Lives Matter ally. And I know where I was coming from. Like, I feel like I do a good job at, self-reflection and really trying to understand, like, am I being performative, or am I genuinely feeling this way? And yet still, I didn't want to come across as like, let me make this about me. And like, let me make this about me as like, oh, look at me, I'm a supporter of Black Lives Matter, how cool. I just never wanted to come across that way. So as a result, I think I felt the better thing to do was to be silent, which in hindsight isn't the right thing to do, right? So I struggle with that. Number one is like, where do I, how do I fit in as a person of color, but not a Black person, when I'm trying to support the Black Lives Matter movement? How do I fit into that in a way that doesn't feel performative, or doesn't come across as performative, but genuinely supports the movement? And then, with the recent sort of Asian violence that's been happening, I've been so happy to see so many Black creators being so vocal about this is wrong, and saying that we, as people of color in general, all communities of color, we have to come together. Like, these sort of calls to, like you were saying, Abe, these calls for us as all people of color, all non-white people, to come together and recognize that, yes, historically there have been clashes between our communities. There's no question. I think back to, Rodney King and the LA riots, and, Koreans and Blacks. And I mean, the history is there.
Then, yeah.
And then even the model minority myth, which came up decades ago in the US, where suddenly Asians were being viewed as like the model minority. Like, look at these Asian people, you work hard, then you can be successful. Look at that. But
Tiger
the purpose
mom.
of that movement, right? But the purpose of that movement was not to praise Asian people for their hard work. It was to show that look how awful Black people are. Like, that was the purpose of that movement, So, but that's the history of it. But, when you see decades later today what it's turned into, it turns into this like Black versus Asian, that one group is better than the other. And it just basically shows how the white supremacy driven movements have caused wedges in the people of community color in general, and communities of color, right? Like, the whole model minority myth was perpetuated by white people. It was for the purpose of separating Blacks and Asians, right? So my whole hope, I do agree with you, is that overall we can all come together to say that we have a collective goal here of fighting white supremacy, of recognizing that we can collectively have a voice together, even if we've had differences culturally or, clashes in the past. Thanks, Abe.
All
Thank
right, you
you.
have a
Good
good
work.
day.
Good work on your end. You're doing such good work.
I feel really like it is just my responsibility to remind everybody that we matter. You know what I mean? And I think that that's the only way you can do that is by talking to people, not only at
Right.
people.
Right. Yeah, I hear it. I like that.
Okay, good. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Abe. All right, we'll talk soon.
Thanks for doing this.
Okay, have a great day.
You too.